I think that Elvis Presley influenced the world around me so dramatically that he exercised an influence over me, even though I wasn't aware of him. I did eventually check out some things, parts of Jailhouse Rock. I think that Elvis Presley, of all of the rock stars, probably put me in the position I was in when it came to my love for poetry. Because I discovered my mother used to read Edgar Allan Poe to me, and I discovered him again in third grade or so and began memorizing The Raven. But what happened in Jailhouse Rock was a scene, at least I think it was Jailhouse Rock, where he goes to a party of adults who want to engage him in sophisticated discussion of jazz or whatever he was doing. And he just turns up his nose and walks away. And this sort of impacted on young attitudes about older people when it came to the arts. They, in turn, uh, sort of felt rejected but withheld their um, approval and used their approval very shrewdly as the years went by and culture changed. So it was impacted on me to sort of go off in my own direction and find poetry the way people who think about things that are absorbing to them tend to consider it philosophizing, even if they don't know anything about the forms, the lyceum, the um, obscure ideas of philosophical discussion at an academic level, which can be like Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance. I mean, it's really intricate ideas. The noumena, for example, is almost indescribable. It's so remote from what you would normally try to come to grips with. So, you know, it doesn't deter somebody from admiring, like Confucius, for his ability to believe that there were virtues that were inborn and that we then cultivate them. Sort of like Micah 6:8, God gave you the power to tell you what is good and asks that you live rightly. You know, the inborn virtues was an idea that has a lot of ramifications for the way that I began to think about poetry. Mother Goose, for example, seemed like an inborn virtue. And, rub a dub dub, it seemed like an inborn virtue. And Dutch Master cigar boxes seemed to have an archetype. They called it a trademark, came from Rembrandt. But ideas sort of took place as wallflowers. A porcelain balloon in a gently drifting arc, just sort of took place in my mind. I might have painted it rather than saved it for a poem. But I saved it for a poem. These sort of things sort of became part of my background. I woke up um, one day from a long sleep at night, and before I woke up, a really amazing series of cognitions was going by, and I managed to come to consciousness with nothing left of it but rosy early waters of years comes cheap. And that was a wallflower. Of course, it's not lost on me that reading poetry is wise and helpful, and that part of the job of being a poet is doing so, getting to know the canon. And the poetry has certain kinds of structural challenges, and and the people bring to it as a game, like the sonorous view of poetry, that it's meant to be part of music, which is called lyricism, and or that it's epic, which is like balladeers, and there's limericks and haikus and things like this, and it gets to be the sort of thing that Elvis might have turned up his nose at if he were a poet. But it's relevant. I mean, the most of it by Robert Frost is a superb piece of art. And if I hadn't learned to look at poems and learn to read them and try to keep up with what's happening in the language of a poem and bring it to life, I might have missed it. I have no doubt that there's beautiful treasures that I have missed of Walt Whitman and Wordsworth and Wallace Stevens. I went through periods of liking certain people, Richard Brautigan and so forth. He was a short fiction writer, which reminded me sort of his stories told in his vernacular of poetry. Now, it didn't last for very long. I mean, I didn't stick with him. I can see the sort of unfaithful things that Bob Dylan does to mesmerize and overwow. And I compare them to Hart Crane, who's real. I mean, you have to understand, I have certain kinds of positions because I'm younger than the 60s movement. I was battered during the civil rights movement by adults who didn't care that a child was being battered. So there's a lot of strange differences. Like the people who used neurohypnosis on me as a child certainly wouldn't stop from doing it today on the masses. I mean, the media make a puppet show reveals the hidden hand of certain poetic gurus, the way that they use images and stereotypes and reconcile them with the movement for social justice, which is, important. So we study our past, we study our history, and sometimes poetry can be very relevant. Some poems, I might suspect them of having two faces, but sometimes they're very appropriate to the times. Lyrics can be like that. You know, um, Country Joe and the Fish's songs at Woodstock, or song at Woodstock, whatever it was, seems to me to be two faced. And they say the F word instead of LOVE. And then it's like, what's that smell? I don't know. It just seems two faced. But the song itself, I mean, if you look at um, Richie Havens, it's freedom marching through the Birmingham War. It's beautiful. And the civil rights movement that took place in rock, legendary history. So, I mean, there were times when I reached in the direction of rock, but propertizing poetry as a rock legend is, I think, unfaithful to the reality. Now, I'm a deaf person, for one thing. Music doesn't have that much to do with my development. But I see, you know, language skill is going beyond just poetry. Identifying something as poetic sometimes means avoiding the mesmerization that leads to sonorous lyrics. And if you look at the problem of like a deaf person trying to, a person who can hear trying to explain to the deaf what music is, you might show them a color wheel. Say the music does this with the vibrations that go in your ear. It blends things and makes them, but I mean, my best friend says it's better to be deaf. Music doesn't do it. She says that when I see people listening to music, it's just making them weird. I don't care for it. It's not that I never cared for any music or any lyrics. It's just that I find it a little bit unusual that it was used the way it was now that I see how it was used. And that's a challenge to the idea that poetry should be political statements for social justice because it's weaponizing poetry. But at the same time, you don't want to cop out. It is a skill, but you don't want it to be misused either. And the god awful clever at misusing things. We're sort of an uploaded upgrade advancement on Orwell's old theories. Things have just gotten more pernicious sometimes when it comes to that. But some of it is very brilliant, and you hope it's not as bad as the totalitarians, but it's scary, what's happened. But the bottom line is that poetry has priceless sensibility in terms of what your character wants from self-expression, and it's part of like the search for the content of your character. I mean, freedom of speech tends to exaggerate and aggravate the idioms of what's normal from Hollywood. Say, defend this, defend the Axis gangster movies, defend the, you know, adrenal destructiveness, and say that's powerful language. It just illustrates why powerfulness is, you know, questionable as honorific. When sensible, sensitive, reasonable, meaningful, contributing, beneficial, appreciative are all much more honorable words than even the word honorable. I mean, it means you're cultivating what's good, what's right, the essential virtues, Micah 6:8. I think that there's sort of an inborn virtue to poetry. I mean, face it, poets don't get paid. I mean, they spend as much time and work as hard, and it's backbreaking. I mean, that's just a figure of speech. You don't need to twist your ankle about it, Louis. It's as painting or writing music. It's as much an investment in your hobby time or your professional time, or your teaching time or your career life as any of the arts. And yet it seldom gets recognized and seldom gets paid. So angling off in your own direction in poetry has, a cultural background to it that some people probably who respond that way to themselves with the idea of poetry aren't even aware of. Like, it took me a long time to identify Elvis as a person who enculturated America to say, oh, to heck with the imposters and academics when we're the real, which I don't like it. I love academics. I find beautiful poetic sensibilities in a lot of academic writing. So somebody said, well, why don't you have more academic comprehension of the poetic crafts? It's not that I completely lack comprehension of the poetic crafts, but my culture sort of tabooed it at a time when I was being forbidden and molested for going to school. So it's kind of a topsy-turvy proposition to question my discipline as a poet. But I understand that revision and reading and the ability to find good poetry and the sense to hold on to one when you do find it. I mean, I found some really good poems that are lost now. And willingness to try some things that you haven't read before. All of that comes down to like a Confucian idea of poetry, that there's an inborn virtue. I'm not expecting anybody to agree with me, but I see it as the stunted sister of the arts. one that is like Linus Van Pelt's Christmas tree. It needs to be surrounded with a warm blanket so it stands upright and shows its self-respect. Poetry is a nibbled edge of leaf, and yet so clearly a cause.